And then the next thing I know, my whole vision was filled with blue light. And when the light disappeared, I looked back at my EFIS and could see nothing. I looked out and there was a few bright lights that I could see in my field of view, but essentially I was practically blind at that point.
That's Jonathan Fay talking about his laser attack. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today, Jonathan Fay shares a story that he and I have waited almost a year to tell. His aircraft was struck by a powerful industrial laser, and temporarily he could not see his instruments. But unlike most victims of laser attacks, Jonathan fought back and brought a laser-wielding criminal to justice. And today he tells that riveting story for the first time. Last week in episode 295, we talked with Catherine Cavagnaro about a crash that occurred in Kentucky that killed a young CFI and his student, and about the CFI's social media posts during the flight. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/295. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, go to whatever app that you're using to listen to me and take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key, or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've been listening for a while and you've learned one or two things from this show that will help you become a safer pilot, or maybe even to pass a check ride, think about what you might pay a flight instructor for a flight and make a donation to help support the show. You can do that now by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome or aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Coming up in the news for October 9th, 2023, the FAA has proposed a new AD for a Garmin product. The Cirrus SR-22 crashes in Australia, and the birthplace of the Piper Cub may be up for sale. All this and more, and the news starts now. From avweb.com, the FAA has proposed a new airworthiness directive requiring operators of thousands of aircraft to update Garmin autopilot software to address a flaw causing the autopilot to make unintended flight control inputs. According to the agency, the AD was issued in response to an incident involving an F-33A Bonanza experiencing an uncommanded automatic pitch trim runaway when the autopilot was first engaged. The proposed rule states, quote, "The affected autopilot system software does not properly handle certain hardware failures of the pitch trim servo. This could result in an automatic uncommanded pitch trim runaway and loss of control of the airplane." The FAA estimates the AD would affect 5,900 aircraft equipped with the autopilot system, including Beech Bonanzas, Commanders, Cessna Pistons, Daher TB-20s and TB-21s, Mooney's M20 series, and Piper Cherokees. However, the FAA estimates a fix will be relatively cheap for operators at around $85. The agency is proposing operators complete the installation of the updated Garmin autopilot software within a 1-year time frame. The proposed rule will be published on October 10th, and the FAA will accept public comment until November 24th. Meanwhile, many of those affected have already resolved the issue since Garmin released the software fix earlier this year. The updated GFC 500 software is for GI 275, G5, and G3X touch installations. From yahoo.com, Cirrus SR-22 crashes in Australia. The Cirrus SR-22 crashed last week near Canberra, Australia, killing all on board. The 65-year-old pilot was flying with his 3 grandchildren, ages 6 through 11. The aircraft crashed about 16 minutes after takeoff from Canberra Airport, crashing to the ground and bursting into flames. Now, I've looked at various sources of data, and apparently there was an IFR flight plan filed for this flight. I also looked at the weather data, and the freezing level was around 5,000 feet, and there were clouds in the area. I'm guessing that the aircraft picked up ice in the climb because it leveled out, yet there was no increase in airspeed, which you'd typically expect as an aircraft levels out. Now, the aircraft was an early model built in 2002, and the TKS anti-icing was introduced as an option in late 2002. However, pictures of this aircraft taken before its accident showed that it did not have TKS panels and hence no anti-icing capability. The aircraft was destroyed by a fire, and thus far it's unknown whether there were any attempts to use the CAPS parachute. Now, in an icing accident near Lake Tahoe many years ago, an SR-22 iced up and the pilot lost control and entered a rapid descent. Unfortunately, he was over 200 knots when he deployed the parachute, which shredded, becoming useless, and it was a fatal accident. So if you do encounter ice and you think you might need to use a parachute if you have one in your aircraft, you'll want to use it before you lose control and exceed the maximum parachute deployment speed. From generalaviationnews.com, fixation on finding the runway captures pilot attention. This comes from an ASRS NASA report written by the pilot. He wrote, while descending on a solo night training landing at Nut Tree Airport, that's Victor Charlie Bravo, in Vacaville, California, I was unable to identify the runway or runway end identifier lights for a planned base leg to final approach. I failed to maintain situational awareness of my altitude and continued to descend to approximately 250 feet AGL before I identified the runway and realized my altitude. I performed a go-around, re-entered the traffic pattern, and completed the landing. The chain of events began with my inability to locate the runway while already descending and my commitment to my base to final approach plan. My fixation on locating the runway took my attention away from managing my altitude. I created risk by starting a descent and not modifying my approach plan when I had not identified the runway. And I'd like to add that flying at night is more challenging, and so you want to simplify your approach as much as possible. So at night, when flying to my home airport, I never accept the tower's offer of a base entry and instead request to make right traffic. That way I'm entering on the 45 at pattern altitude, and the landing becomes very standard, much like in the daytime. If you do choose to enter on the base at night, you may have a more difficult time identifying the altitude you should be at each point along the base leg, and you could end up low, as this pilot did. So when flying at night, try to make your traffic patterns as standard as possible. From generalaviationnews.com, mystery midair collision for Alaska pilot. This comes from an NTSB report. The pilot reported that while in level cruise flight over an area of remote and unpopulated terrain near Chickaloon, Alaska, at an altitude of about 1,500 feet MSL, he noticed a dark flash in the upper left corner of the Cessna 180's windscreen. He immediately pitched the nose of the airplane down and to the right to avoid another airplane. With his airplane operating normally and unaware that the two airplanes had contacted each other, he continued to his destination. During a post-flight inspection, he noticed black marks and metal damage on the upper surface of the left wing. Post-accident examination revealed that the airplane had sustained substantial damage to the left wing and what appeared to be a black tire mark. The other aircraft involved has not been identified. Probable cause, a mid-air collision for reasons that could not be determined based on the available evidence. And in other news headlines, saving a buck cost a fortune. The NTSB has released a report on a Cessna Cardinal that ran out of gas near Ayer, that's A-Y-E-R, Massachusetts. The pilot glided safely down, but the plane was damaged. According to the NTSB, quote, during the investigation, it was revealed that the pilot had passed up 3 other airports during the flight as the avgas was 20 cents per gallon cheaper at his chosen fuel stop. And NTSB confirms otter crash cause, fix already certified. The NTSB confirmed earlier suspicions that a mechanical failure was likely the cause of a DHC-3 otter floatplane crash near Whidbey Island in Washington state last year that killed all 10 on board. According to the report, the crash resulted from the disconnection of the actuator that moved the aircraft horizontal stabilizer controlling pitch. It says that secondary retention devices will be needed to prevent that type of failure in the future. Pilot attempts to beat a thunderstorm go awry. The NTSB has released a report on a Boeing PT-17 Stearman that crashed while taking off from a road near Winnie, Texas. The airplane had substantial damage, and the pilot survived with minor injuries. As the airplane approached power lines above a road signal light, the pilot decided to fly under the power lines, but encountered a sudden wind shift that caused the airplane to settle. And finally in the news, Lock Haven looking at selling Piper Cub birthplace. The future of Lock Haven's William T. Piper Memorial Airport, former home of Piper Aircraft Corporation, is up in the air as the city grapples with selling the facility. Despite an economic impact of more than $13 million, the city of Lock Haven, Pennsylvania, says the airport is not making the city enough money to justify continued operation by the city. However, they say they don't intend to sell the airport for non-aviation purposes and have suggested businesses collaborate to buy the airport and oversee its operations. However, airport advocates are holding out hope the city will reconsider, given the airport's history and its importance to the community. As the birthplace of the iconic Piper Cub, The aircraft manufacturer called the airport home from 1937 to 1984. While Piper's factory production has since moved to Florida, the airport continues to pay tribute to its historic past with a museum dedicated to preserving its legacy located adjacent to the airport. Ron Dremel, president of the Piper Aviation Museum, says it receives about 2,500 to 3,000 visitors annually. The airport averages 48 operations a day. As the only public airport in Clinton County, local tenants say the airport is vital for pilot training, a reliever for emergency flights, and instrumental in the case of natural disasters. Additionally, the airport is home to 9 aviation businesses. Now, Lock Haven also has the distinction of being the very first airport that I ever landed at on a solo cross-country flight way back in 1975. And then exactly 20 years and 1 day later, in 1995, I have a logbook entry that says, followed Pine Creek to LHV, bought Piper Cub print at Sentimental Journey, passenger, Mom. Now, that print was signed by the artist Burt Mader and by W.T. Bill Piper Jr., who was president of the company that was originally founded by his father, Bill Sr. Sentimental Journey is an annual fly-in at Lock Haven, which features a pancake breakfast, and many owners fly their Pipers to the event, though, of course, non-Piper owners are also welcome. The logbook says I flew a 172 in when I attended. The 38th annual Sentimental Journey to Cub Haven fly-in is Saturday, June 22nd, 2024, so put it on your calendar now. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates, and then our conversation with Jonathan Fay about how pilots can fight back when they're struck by a laser. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. Let's go first to the good news. First, congratulations to mega supporter Dan Morris, who recently passed both his CFI and CFII. He says, "Morning, Max. Still a big fan of your work. I listen to the ad-free versions of today's podcast. It's available through Patreon. I recently finished my CFI and II and just say that what you and Catherine said about needing good instructors spoke to me. I have no interest in airline flying as I don't care to be away from home that much. My 22 years in the military did enough of that. However, I love to teach, but we are in a flight school desert where I live. Almost none around, so I have to set out on my own and start one from scratch. Fingers crossed. Keep up the good work. And I'll definitely ensure that my students listen to your podcast. And if anyone has good information on setting up a small flight school, pass that along to me and I'll pass that on to Dan. So Dan, congratulations to you and good luck with your flight school. And over the weekend, I watched the full 2.25 hours of the Senate Transportation Committee's confirmation hearing of FAA Administrator nominee Michael Whitaker. I've never watched one of these before. It was really quite interesting. I will tell you that there was strong bipartisan support for him throughout the entire hearing, so I expect that he will get confirmed. It was interesting that most of his answers were relatively short and that most of the senators extracted a number of commitments from him, some as simple as, will you commit to visiting Alaska soon, or will you commit to visiting Indiana soon, but also on other programs as well. So fascinating to watch, and hopefully we'll get a new FAA administrator soon. Now, the NTSB report just came out on a Britten-Norman BN-2A twin-engine aircraft that crashed in November 2021, and I wanted to read a little bit from that because I thought it was kind of interesting. The aircraft was substantially damaged when it was involved in an accident near Beaver Island, Michigan. Unfortunately, the pilot and 3 passengers were fatally injured, and 1 passenger received serious injuries. The airplane was operated as a Part 135 air taxi flight. The airplane departed Charlevoix Municipal Airport, CVX, in Charlevoix, Michigan at about 1:32 p.m. After departing CVX, the aircraft turned north and proceeded directly toward Welke Airport, 6Y8 on Beaver Island, Michigan. The airplane stalled and impacted the ground about 300 feet short of the destination runway. GPS data showed the airplane speed was at or near the published stall speed for the airplane's given loading condition. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the fuselage and both wings. Examination of the airplane verified flight and engine control continuity. No pre-impact anomalies were found with respect to the airplane engines or systems. The pilot allowed the airspeed to decrease during the approach, increased pitch attitude, and exceeded critical angle of attack. which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and spin into terrain. The chief pilot for the operator witnessed the accident. He stated that he heard the pilot announce that he was at Sand Bay, a location that the operator's pilots use as a reporting point about 5 minutes from the airport. He stated that he left his house, which is adjacent to the airport, to meet the airplane, and he could see the airplane was flying very slowly in a near stall position. He stated that it appeared to be flying nose up with no power. He realized that the pilot only had a few seconds to lower the nose and add power before the airplane stalled. His first reaction was that the airplane was wallowing and that no one was flying the airplane. He stated that the airplane did not recover from the nose-high attitude, then stalled and impacted the ground. Now, according to the operator's report, the pilot had a lot of experience. He had accumulated a total of 2,949 hours of total flight time, and he had 136 hours in the accident aircraft make and model. The airplane impacted the ground about 110 feet east of the extended centerline of the runway 35 and 320 feet south of the runway threshold. The turf runway was 3,500 feet long and had a displaced threshold just beyond its intersection with paved runway 927. Wind at the time was 320 at 11 knots, gusting to 20 knots, so a 30-degree left crosswind. Now, the NTSB report includes this information from the FAA. It says, while maneuvering an airplane at low altitude in VMC, many pilots fail to avoid conditions that lead to an aerodynamic stall, recognize the warning signs of a stall onset, and apply appropriate recovery techniques. Many stall accidents result when a pilot is momentarily distracted from the primary task of flying, such as while maneuvering in the airport traffic pattern, during an emergency, or when fixating on ground objects. An aerodynamic stall can happen at any airspeed, at any altitude, and with any power engine settings. Pilots need to be honest with themselves about their knowledge of stalls and preparedness to recognize and handle a stall situation. And this is probably the most important part. It says, reducing angle of attack by lowering the airplane's nose at the first indication of a stall is the most important immediate response for stall avoidance and stall recovery. This may seem counterintuitive at low altitudes, but is a necessary first step. And I agree. I often see people adding power rather than lowering the nose when they are on short final and are coming up short. There was also information from an interview of a pilot who landed earlier. He flew for a Part 135 operator that flew the same route and landed 13 minutes prior to the accident. He said he noticed a line of rain-snow showers that began about a mile south of Welke Airport and extended to the southern edge of Beaver Island. He did not think the wind conditions were particularly challenging, but he said the weather situation had been changing very quickly throughout the day, which was not an unusual situation when flying to the Beaver Island area. Now, that last statement, that the weather had been changing quickly, may be key, because if the pilot was experiencing a downdraft, he may have simply raised the nose to try and regain the proper sight picture. However, doing that slows the aircraft and in the extreme will lead to a stall. And I see this all the time when I'm flying with clients into the Livermore, California airport. There is a lot of grass immediately before both runways, and beyond that area, there's a lot of pavement and concrete that heats up. So typically the air is rising over the hotter paved areas as we first approach the airport, but then the air is descending over the grass that we fly over immediately before the runway. And I consistently see clients get slow over the grass as they compensate for the downdraft by raising the nose when they should instead be adding power. Probable cause was listed as the pilot's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack during final approach, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall and loss of control at an altitude too low to recover. And I did find a newspaper article that said that the pilot was a full-time history teacher. He had worked for 16 years in the Traverse City School District, and that he liked to fly on weekends. And just a quick reminder that this is a listener-supported show. Surprisingly, it's been less than a week since the last episode, but no new supporters. I don't think that's ever happened before. So if you've been thinking about supporting the show and just haven't gotten around to it, now would be a great time to do that. It's really easy to do. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, where you can make a monthly donation via Patreon and also get some goodies, which the website will tell you about, or you can make a one-time donation by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And of course, when you sign up to support the show, I'll read your name on the show. Thanks so much for your support. And let me also remind you about a great new podcast called Air Traffic Out of Control. I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it again because it's so good. The podcast brings you rather interesting ATC recordings that are sometimes funny and occasionally unbelievable. Now, the show is also hosted by Amy Tango Charlie, which of course stands for ATC, and she has the most delightful British accent. Anyway, there's a new episode out every Wednesday, and then short flyby episodes throughout the week. So look for Air Traffic Out of Control wherever you go for podcasts. Coming up next, our conversation with Jonathan Fay about his laser attack and how he fought back. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about laser strikes again, because this problem is not going away. There are two ways to fight them, either after the attack, as Jonathan will describe, or before the attack by wearing laser eyewear protection when you fly at night. Now, you may recall that last year in episode 223, we talked with Kelly Krajewski of Revision Military about their new laser eyewear protection designed specifically for pilots. They sent me a sample pair to try, and I now wear those glasses when I fly at night, and they give me a lot of confidence that I can handle any laser attack that might occur. After our conversation with Jonathan, I'll remind you about them, how you can order them, and the discount code that they've created for Aviation News Talk listeners. And now let me tell you a little about Jonathan Fay. He's been a pilot since 1986, and he built a glass cockpit Zenith CH-750 bush plane with which he and his son have explored backcountry strips, gravel bars, and islands of the Pacific Northwest. He's a 30-year Microsoft veteran and currently works on the HoloLens and mixed reality products. And now here's our conversation with Jonathan Fay. Well, Jonathan, welcome to the show. I am so happy to have you here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, fortunately, most of us have never been struck by a laser beam. Tell us what it felt like in that moment. What was your instant experience that you had when you first got struck by that beam?
Well, the surprise was that after I looked down thinking that it was police activity with some blue lights flashing in an alley. I looked down at it briefly, and then the next thing I know, my whole vision was filled with blue light. And when the light disappeared, I looked back at my EFIS and could see nothing. I looked out, and there was a few bright lights that I could see in my field of view, but essentially I was practically blind at that point. And I was just turning base for landing at Arlington Airport in north of Seattle. And so I realized at this point that if I didn't figure out how to get some situational awareness and context, that this might result in my fatality. And I had people light me up with old red laser pointers in the past, and I saw it mainly as an annoyance. But this was something where, literally the light flashes before your eyes, and you just realize that this is very, very serious.
Tell us what kind of aircraft you were in. You had mentioned to me that there was a lot of glass, and I don't know, what kind of aircraft it was.
It's a Zenith 750 cruiser that I have built as a backcountry aircraft with 28-inch balloon tires and vortex generators, in-flight variable prop. But one of the other features is I'm a fairly big guy. I fly with my son, who's also a pretty big guy. And I don't like the feeling like you're in a meat locker like in a 172. So we have very big glass bubble doors. All the way from the floor to the ceiling, it's just a glass bubble. So you essentially have no place to hide from a laser in a situation like that. It's a high wing, and even the roof itself is completely glass. It has some advantages. When you're in a turn, you can just look up and see where you're going. And you can look straight down even without slipping and see underneath you with the bubbles. But it gives you no protection against the laser coming from the outside.
Yeah, you can't scrunch down behind the door or anything like that. So how long do you think you were illuminated for? Was it just a fraction of a second or for quite a while?
I think it was several times over probably maybe 10, 12 seconds of flight that before I was able to sort of put my belly towards the laser. But even then, he was lighting up the wings, and with the white paint, it just reflected and spilled completely in through all the windows. And so essentially, there was my direct viewing of the laser, which was pretty quick. And then I realized what it was and tried not to look into it again. But he kept illuminating the whole cockpit by tracking the airplane and reflecting off of the wings into the cockpit. And that just washed everything out with this very bright blue light. And this is not like a traditional laser pointer, but it is like hundreds of times, maybe thousands of times brighter than a traditional pointer. It should be illegal, but these things, a lot of YouTubers are showing them off. And then people who just, have more money than sense go out and buy them on eBay. And a lot of foreign companies just sell them to U.S. marketplaces on these sort of gray market auction sites. And they are a whole different animal than what we've seen in the past with laser pointers, and frankly, a lot more dangerous.
Yeah, it sounds like a lethal weapon.
If I had not been able to brighten the panel up, I would have had no ability to control the airplane or know where I was going. People ask me, why did I choose to land immediately instead of, going around or finding someplace else to go? But by the time I was there, I had a runway, a mile away from me versus not knowing if I could keep the plane under control and find myself around, to someplace safe. And maybe I'd eventually get my night vision back, but could I control the plane at low altitude without knowing what the obstacle clearance is and be able to keep from being illuminated again if I tried another approach?
Yeah, it sounds like it was a pretty scary situation. Where was the perpetrator relative to you? Was he ahead of you and on the right, and you were making right turns? Or describe, where he was when you first got hit.
I was in a left traffic pattern for runway 34 at Arlington, and he was in a storage facility about 45 degrees to the where you would turn base from downwind. And that essentially was right in the path of where most of the aircraft were doing that. And so essentially you've already dropped down from pattern altitude. I believe I was above 700 feet AGL. And so maybe the laser had to go 1,000 feet. So for the power of this laser, it was a significant amount of illumination there.
Wow. Now, I understand you were injured by the laser. Tell us about the doctor visits and all the other ramifications of this. So when I got up the next morning and I looked at a white wall, I would realize that there was this sort of blotch of area that was darker and off color. And so I was concerned, and is approximately where the laser had been in my field of view when I looked at it. And so I was concerned that I might have gotten some permanent eye damage from that. I immediately set up a doctor's appointment to go check on the damage. And I was able to see some artifacts using like a grid of X's, and you had to figure out like, are any of them dimmer than the others, et cetera. And so I could clearly see there was some affect to my vision, but they couldn't see any physical damage to where like permanent cell death or anything like that. They did some follow-up checks, and over time, the spots gradually disappeared. And either I've adjusted to setting that as a new baseline, or the damage is gone, but I don't really have any permanent vision damage here. It was mostly the danger was the immediate loss of all your night vision and the context. Hmm. How long did it take that shadowing to go away in your eyes?
I think I was noticing it for at least a couple of weeks, and then it, gradually faded away to where, again, you just kind of push it into your background after a while. You either get used to it or it healed. It's kind of hard to tell, but I'd look at a wall and kind of notice it, certainly for the first few weeks.
Yeah. So you're kind of unique in that you actually were able to track down the perpetrator here. Now, you had mentioned to me that previously you had listened to our episode 223 on Aviation News Talk when we talked about laser strikes. Did that impact your thinking in any way about dealing with this laser strike?
I think they were talking about the different recommendations of possibly using some sort of anti-laser goggles and things like that. And some of that seemed like, well, maybe if you were flying all the time at night in a helicopter, say a police helicopter that might be, flying low level and a target, something like that might make sense. I didn't know how I could apply that technology directly towards it, but I realized the seriousness of which the prevalence of lasers had gotten so bad that this was not just an occasional theoretical thing, but something that was, more pervasive and also very difficult to track down and probably going to grow. And given that, I realized that it was a lot more serious than, just an annoyance. When the event happened, pardon the pun, it opened my eyes to exactly how bad these new laser beams were. And the fact that I should be reporting this, was sort of made clear through that program. I think also just the aspect of having to deal with that emergency in flight and get the plane on the ground left me with this sense of wanting to forget about it after I was safe on the ground and just, it's like water under the bridge. I can't fight this. A sucky thing happened to me and I'm not going to be able to do about it. That's the helplessness I felt on the ground. I had flown over to help my friend put his hard top on his Jeep for the winter. It was just after Thanksgiving Day holiday. And I didn't even talk to him about this near-death experience during that. I just helped him with that. We went to dinner. I let my eyes adjust. And when I went back out, I, sat and adjusted myself to light and made sure that I was good to fly and flew home. And it was only after I got up that next morning that I just remembered, I've got to report this. And then I just got this anger. It's like, why report it if it's only just going to be a statistic for Max to say about how many more laser strikes there are next year? I decided to look at some of the tools that I had to kind of refresh myself as to what had happened and where it was, and just kind of see if there was anything more I could do about it. But it just, I think mostly made me realize about the rest of the community that was involved. And it wasn't just me. It was, how is it going to affect the next person down the line?
Well, I was certainly impressed with the list of all the things you did. Tell us about the steps you took to track down this perpetrator.
So the next morning, I went ahead and filled out the FAA forms for reporting laser strikes, which you can find online. I also sent email to the FSDO. I went on our social media. We have a really good Facebook group, Flights Above the Pacific Northwest, or FATPNW, that I'm a member of. And there's a lot of pilots and a lot of activity. So I figured that I'd post on that to let people know and see if anybody else had seen this guy. I remembered that this alley, it was a very interesting alley. It almost looked like a little bit of a square with like a square building with buildings around the side of it, which was unusual. And so when I was able to actually look at my ForeFlight track and then overlay that with Google Maps and Bing Maps and then the Bing Street View, I was able to find out that there was a storage location there. And that's when the lights went off. Storage location, cameras, gates, pin pads. Everybody who goes in there is tracked. And at that point, I texted my boss and said, can I take a day off to go investigate this guy? And he said, please do that. Just call it jury duty or something. And so at this point, I tracked down the address because, we have all these modern tools now. Yes, we have these modern weapons, these lasers or whatever that can do so much, but we have everything that's going on with ForeFlight and the GPS trails, all the ADS-B tracking. We have mapping. We have the Street View, being able to find someone's number. I was able to find the name of the storage place, call them up, talk to the manager, explain to them that their property had been used to shine a laser at an airplane. And they were furious. And they said, anything we can do, we'll get it to you. So they went immediately, got the video from it, and they had footage of him doing it and pointing the laser at it. I gave them the time that this had happened, and they were able to pinpoint it. They had his name. They had all the information. And then after talking with them, I got off the phone and went on the Facebook group and found out that about an hour after I had been lasered, a CFI was flying over the Arlington area with his student. His student was flying the plane, and they got lit up too. He was, I believe, in a Cessna that he had better protection against the laser coming in the cockpit. So he was able to hold his phone up to the window while he just looked at the screen. So he didn't have to look directly into the laser, and actually was able to get a video of the laser from the ground up. So now we have evidence from the ground showing the perpetrator shining the laser up. And now we have evidence from the sky looking down at the ground showing him shining the laser. So now we've coupled it. We have the guy's name. And so at this point, I realized, hey, I need to take a step back and make sure that I don't contaminate any of this.
Now, that was something that really intrigued me. You talked about chain of custody, and you said that you were familiar with this because of experience you've had in the past. I never would have thought of that. And so tell us about this whole aspect of it. How did you become aware of the importance of chain of custody, and what did you do to assure it in this case?
So I had worked in law enforcement many years in the past. And one of the things going through police academy, they tell you about how you need to handle evidence, and they tell you about, making sure that you don't contaminate any evidence, and that you log everything correctly, and that everything goes through a chain of custody, so that when it goes to court, you don't have the defendant saying, "Oh, well, we don't know where this came from, and it could have been tampered with." And so making sure that, in this day and age where you can just go into an AI and ask it to make videos and pictures, you're not even able to trust almost anything you see. So you need to be able to make sure that everyone knows where everything's been, so that it can be used as proper evidence. And so I called the airport manager at Arlington and asked him to be able to go pick that up and to be able to work with the police to make sure that they got it directly, so that they knew that they got it directly from the storage yard, and that they could confirm that it had never been tampered with.
So this turned out, I think, initially to be a state charge. Later, I understand it became a federal charge. Tell us about that. Why did they throw the book at this gentleman?
One of the challenges is that you almost never catch these guys, because most people don't realize that it's easier than they think. They make a call. They, for instance, the flight instructor that night had called in and let center or approach that he was talking with ATC know that this laser strike had happened, and they gave him the approximate location. But there's not a lot that they can do about this. If the guy, leaves or flees or something, there's really no one there to be able to hand off an investigation in a timely manner. So rarely does anyone ever get caught red-handed to be able to prosecute. The fact that we provided the FAA and the FSDO and Marysville PD with all the video evidence and the flight paths and the guy's name, his address, everything like that, that we had been able to find through his registration with the storage facility. That basically wrapped it up in a bow. They didn't have to do very much investigation other than just grab the evidence, look through it, and then file the charges. And so once that was there and we were able to have the connection to the other flight instructor, you now had a second case against this. So it's not just one random thing. You can show that it's a pattern, and you have both of them on tape. And now this provided a way for the federal authorities to make an example of this. So when you have a person now who's basically, you've got such strong evidence, you're going to be able to get a plea with real jail time on it. And then you're going to be able to say, hey, don't do this. Or you can get caught. You will get caught. And if you do, it's serious jail time.
Did the fact that you had been injured through this have some influence on it being moved from a state charge to a felony, a federal charge?
I think that might have been contributed a little bit to it. I think that the multiple counts is certainly had the multiple counts and the fact that it was a pitching over the plate for them and not really a stretch to convict. It was something that it was somewhat of a golden opportunity. But I think that we were lucky that he did it within a storage yard. But if you consider now the number of ring cameras, blink cameras, security cameras that people have in front of their houses, in front of businesses and everything like that, it's a detriment to our privacy sometimes. But it also means that almost all the public spaces, near airports and things like that, if you can find out where the perpetrator was, you might be able to get him on camera, get a license plate, get a description. And, if you're even lucky in a situation where actually they have his name and address. So it makes it a lot more feasible to track someone down with the technology we have if you're just aware that you can fight back.
Now, you and I first started talking about this, I think, almost a year ago. And we haven't been able to talk about it really until just now. Provide us a timeline with all of your various interactions with the U.S. Attorney's Office and other folks over the last year or so. How has this case progressed over that time frame?
So let's see. So it was the end of Thanksgiving. So when the event occurred, we provided all the evidence that we had collected. That was Sunday evening when it happened. By Monday afternoon, the FSDO and the Arlington Police Department had that. There had to be a jurisdiction change because the storage facility was actually across the street from Arlington in Marysville. So then we had to transfer all the evidence over to the Marysville Police Department. And they went ahead and had their detectives go in and take that up. And then I believe it was about 3 weeks later, they made an arrest on it with that. After that, the FSDO had all that information. And eventually, I believe in January or February, the U.S. Attorney's Office, I got a call from a special agent from the Department of Transportation, NTSB, who is sort of like equivalent to an FBI agent, except they work in transportation crime. So he said he was in charge of investigating this and that the U.S. Attorney's Office was involved. And then literally later that day, got a call from the U.S. Attorney for the Washington State District here, Seattle District. And they informed us that they were going to be looking at this for the federal charge. Then later, they had really good communication because they had a victim's right correspondent who would basically keep me up to date on the trial. when I first saw this, I thought, oh, this is going to be a few weeks and they'll get a plea bargain out of this guy, because there's no way with that sort of evidence you're going to want to go to trial. But of course, the legal system runs a lot slower than a Law and Order episode. And I would get a statement from the victim's rights advocate saying there's going to be a hearing on this date, and you have a right to be able to make statements or do this, or we'll just keep you informed. And then it would move back and it would move back. And I had got a hold of you and said that I thought it was pretty important that people know that they can fight back. But as I talked with the U.S. attorney, everything that I would say if I talked on your podcast would also mean that we would have to turn that in as evidence for the defense as well, which would then complicate things and just kind of make for more of a challenge for filing it. And also they wanted to know that this had been sort of disposed of in terms of that there was a plea agreement accepted. So right now, last Thursday, he pled guilty. The U.S. attorney had asked me whether I would be okay with him taking a plea bargain. And they also asked the other victim as well. Because I had been injured and I had more the threat of the immediate issue of potentially, having the plane crash. And it was something that to me felt a lot more like attempted murder than just someone playing with a laser pointer. But finding out this guy was a drug addict, and when they went to arrest him for the federal charges, he was already in jail for yet another unrelated crime. So there's a part of me that felt like, hey, let's throw the book at him. But one of the things that they said is that they would allow a plea bargain for, I believe it's going to be a recommendation of a year plus 3 years of probation and drug counseling. And if he doesn't go through with it, he could be held for the 10 years per count. And so he has very strong encouragement to get his life back together. A lot of people have asked me, why would someone do something like this? Why would they shine a laser at an airplane? I think there may be people who are just plain ignorant or stupid, or they think it's funny, or they don't realize that harm could come of this. But I think drugs, alcohol, mental illness, might contribute to some of that. But also kind of like people who are just jerks who think they're not going to get caught, just do it as an impulse. And if we can get the message out that it does cause harm, and you can be held responsible of it, and you can do real jail time, I think it will open up a lot of possibilities for people being aware of that. And also just pilots knowing you can fight back. For me, the night before, I was just going to let it go, and I was going to try to forget it as a bad experience. But that morning after, understanding and thinking about your show and hearing about the other pilots and other things like that, realizing this is more about what we can do for the community. And it's just not, it's unlikely to happen to me again, but we got one guy off the street now who has already at least had 2 victims that we were able to know. I'm sure this guy had probably lit up many more airplanes, but we just couldn't get a hold of them. So if they had reported it, we would have been able to correlate more of those together.
So you mentioned 10 years. Is that the maximum that he could be sentenced to for this crime for a single count?
I believe that's what I read in the disclosures in the plea agreement. So the judge can impose a longer sentence if he wants. He's not bound by the plea agreement. But generally, they try to follow up with it. My feeling is if the guy cleans up his act, then some good outcome has happened out of it, and there's enough teeth in this that it can serve as a warning to others. If he doesn't clean up his act, he's got a sentence that he cannot appeal, because you can't appeal a plea agreement. So I think it's maybe better than something tied up in appeals for years.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, and I had read online that the maximum fine was $250,000. So not only can they do jail time, they can assess a huge penalty if they want to.
I think part of the plea agreement is he's going to have to pay back my insurance company for roughly $1,000 of medical visits or something, and potentially my employer for the sick time I had to take for the time off to go to see the doctor and such. But if I had had any financial damages directly due to that, he would have had to compensate as well. So there is some more responsibility in taking a plea agreement that I think is somewhat a healthier way if you can rehabilitate someone, and not just, someone just spending a lot of time in jail and coming out worse than before isn't as good an outcome as someone spending a little less time and coming out a better person. And I can hope for that. And if it doesn't happen, well,
yeah, no, that would certainly be great if he came out as a productive person afterwards. I've read about many laser strikes over the years, and the vast majority of them occur when someone strikes a police helicopter or a police airplane. And I have done a ride-along in a police airplane, a 206 for California Highway Patrol. And I know that the equipment they have on board, they would be able to identify the exact address where that is happening almost instantaneously. And so that's why I think most of these convictions for laser strikes are when people are unlucky enough to light up a police aircraft. Now, for people like you and I think it's probably relatively rare that those people are able to, catch their perpetrators, which you've done. What advice would you offer to fellow pilots about laser strikes? Anything at all about a laser strike? What advice would you offer up?
So I think one of the things I didn't cover was the 3 minutes between when I lost my night vision and getting down onto the runway. And I think some of the lessons learned about being prepared ahead of time, I had thought, what if I get in a situation where I'm in accidental IMC or other situations, and had looked at a lot of videos. Dave Herschel had this video about using an EFIS and synthetic vision to land blind and do a 0-0 approach. And they actually did an experiment with a pilot, and he successfully brought the plane down twice. Now, they, of course, ended with a caveat of, this, you shouldn't do this. But it left me with, if that was the only choice I had, that is an option to live, right? I was lucky that besides my cockpit being made out of glass, I had a glass cockpit, and my Dynon HDX came with synthetic vision, but I couldn't see it. This is the one thing that, was grace of God that I just had happened to dim my display, and I'd gone through the button presses where you have to hit a button on the panel, and then you have to tap on user interface to brighten and dim the display. And I had just dimmed it as I came in to be able to have the least distraction possible, but still see my screen. So when I lost my night vision, I couldn't see the EFIS at all. If I had not had the immediate muscle memory to bring it back up to daylight brightness, I wouldn't have been able to use the EFIS. After the incident, I realized that I could have had a physical knob connected to that feature, and I never had installed something like that. And so I went out and bought a knob immediately. I'm working to try to figure out how to connect it to my harness, and I still haven't installed it. So maybe I need to take my own advice and get that in. But once I had the EFIS brightness up, I'd been able to get the wings level after my turn to base by seeing some of the brighter lights and just understanding, to keep my wings level enough. Once I got the EFIS bright enough, I used the map and the synthetic vision to be able to turn onto the heading of the runway using the runway extended lines, and lined up on the runway. And I said, Arlington's 8,000 feet long or something. I have a bush plane that can land in 150 feet. I should be able to figure out how to get down on this. It's a big, wide runway. And so I brought it down. I set it up for the right speeds. And when I got down to where the synthetic vision showed me above the runway, I just bled off the speed and my wheels touched the ground. And I, yanked the rest of the power and put on the brakes and made the first intersection. I was thinking I had another 7,000 feet. I could have slowly descended on it. But that thought to be able to use that functionality and sort of Dave Herschel's video about doing it. And I think that like listening to your podcast, listening to all the aviation safety content, including, Rest His Soul, Richard's videos as well, is something that just prepares you so that when something happens like this, you're going back to something you've thought about before and not having to make it up on the spot. Because while it seemed like a long time, between the laser light up and touching down was around 2 minutes, or maybe even slightly less. And you have to think that quickly.
Well, I think a key thing you're talking about here is preparation. And we do that for all kinds of emergencies and incidents in aircraft. And I think probably the difference is with laser strikes. I think pilots are aware that they're a possibility, but I have never heard of anyone taking any preparation in advance or thinking about how to deal with it. And I think what you point out here is there are things that you can do to at least prepare yourself for that situation and hopefully be in a better position to survive it. As we're starting to wrap up here, any other final thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, I think that some of the preparation that you can make for the laser strikes, you can also consider if you lost your night vision for some other reason, like someone accidentally turning on a flashlight and getting it in your eyes or something like that. The time, I do a lot of astronomy, and one of the things when someone turns a flashlight on at a star party, you get a lot of groans and bad vibes at that person who turned their headlights on or something, because it takes a long time to get the sensitivity back to be able to do that. And flying at night is something where you definitely want to be able to have the best context possible. Certainly, advice that you've given too is, night flying and being prepared with IFR training and the instrumentation and the situational awareness. It's just worth it. I can't imagine what it had been like trying to land in my circumstance with old-fashioned six-pack and steam gauges. All that you can do to help your situational awareness and be prepared ahead of time is worthwhile. And then once you're on the ground and you're safe, all the technology we have today, put some effort into it. And you can use all these tools we use for flight planning and for, finding out where to get the best deal on, at a store and how to get there and everything. It's all available. We can use it to track down who perpetrated that. So just opening your eyes to that as a possibility instead of, and make sure you report it. Even if that's all you do, the reporting can help put together the patterns and hold people accountable.
Jonathan, I say this with all sincerity. You are my hero. You've been struck by a laser beam. You fought back and you got some justice for it. Thanks so much for sharing your story with us here today.
And thank you so much for sharing everyone's story every week with us. I really appreciate that.
And my thanks to Jonathan Fay for sharing his story with us. If you're struck by a laser, please tell ATC and file a police report. Also, report the laser strike to the FAA, and to do that, you can use the link in our show notes. The show notes also contain links to an FAA brochure on laser eye protection. And if you do get a laser strike someday and have success in tracking down the perpetrator, please contact me so that I can share that information with everyone. Now, back in episode 223, we interviewed Kelly Krajewski of Revision Military, and she explained how the company worked with the U.S. Air Force labs to develop a dye that would absorb the light used by lasers that are commonly used to strike aircraft while still passing the most common colors used in glass cockpit displays. That way, pilots can still view their displays while wearing laser eye protection. Now, I contacted the company to get an update on their products, though they didn't get back to me before I released this show. So the prices may have changed, but in 2022, they were offering two products: the Stinger Hawk for helicopter pilots, which was priced at $199, and the SF2 for fixed-wing pilots that sells for $499. To order either of the protective eyewear products mentioned, you need to send them an email to sales@revisionmilitary.com, or you can call them to order at 802-879-7002. And they were offering a 15% discount to listeners when you order using the discount code Aviation News Talk, which has no spaces in it. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's maybe sliding upside down.